If you want to know the differences between mainstream school and deaf school, this is the video for you. I'm going to go over it just briefly on the differences between the two and also the advantages and disadvantages of going to mainstream schools versus deaf school. But of course, if you want a more general overview, if you want maybe a bit more an overview side-by-side comparison, I suggest you check out the link in the description. I have put together a post where you can look at it, you can read it, maybe it's easier for you. That would be a best place for you as well. But if you prefer this way, let's go over briefly the differences between the two schools. Let's start off with mainstream school. What is mainstream school? Well, that's the common one. That's the one that most of us are familiar with. That's the one that we see everywhere because it's something that most students go to. It's a general one. It's governed by the same education board in the country. You don't tend to see people with disability there. You might be seeing a minority, but the majority will not really have any disability or any special requirements, anything like that. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there aren't any, because I have been to mainstream school, even though I'm someone who's mildly deaf, and I've been to mainstream school my entire life. And I've explained about that. I've talked about that in the video. You can check it out in the description again. And that is my own experience, not like everyone else. Everyone has their own unique experiences. But mainstream school, you see it everywhere. This is a common one that we see in most places. And that's why it's quite confusing whether to work out should you go there or not if you are deaf or hard of hearing. On the other hand, when you have deaf school, they are more niche, which means that it's less common. You don't see it as often as the mainstream schools, so it might be a bit more difficult to find them, but they do exist. And of course, in this particular situation, deaf schools are more suited for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, and more suited for them rather than other forms of requirements that a person might need. Having said that, there are, again, pros and cons of both types of schools. So let's go over it just briefly on what you need to be aware of. And of course, when I'm going to go over it briefly, I'm just going to go over it from the perspective of a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. And in this case will be the children, the students who are attending. From another person's perspective, it might be a different kind of thing that you need to be aware of. But let's just go over it from a perspective of deaf, hard of hearing students who are, let's just start with mainstream school. One of the big advantages of mainstream school, I've mentioned it, is that it's very common. You see it everywhere. You have more choices available to you. That might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, who knows, but it might be more difficult to pick which school you go to, maybe depending on your location, but you have more options, and at the same time they will be governed by the same authority, education board, education body, which means that you have some kind of consistency between each school. And that will also mean when you go to university or college, it's more recognizable. They will be familiar with those qualifications and those systems that they have in place, and that might be an advantage for you. One of the big things that some people might say if you go to a mainstream school is that you are better prepared for the quote real world. And what I mean by that is the real hearing world, because we live in a hearing world. So if you go to a mainstream school, you may be able to better adjust to the quote real world. So again, is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is it better to focus on a more niche kind of group? Different for everyone. Everyone will have their own case-by-case scenarios. Those are some of the big advantages of going to mainstream school, but obviously there are disadvantages. And the big one, and I'm talking from my own experience, is that it's very, very unlikely, maybe you have very small number of people who will be deaf or hard of hearing like yourself, which means that it's very hard for anyone to resonate with you, to understand you. The teachers will not be able to understand what you need and how to cater for that. Maybe you might be able to experience more form of loneliness because nobody gets it, and that's quite difficult to go through. And I've been through that many times in primary school and high school, but you have to go through with that. And that's kind of same in the world anyway. You may experience loneliness if you are the only deaf person in the group. And because of that, there may be a requirement of some funding, some additional assistance, which some schools may be able to do that. They may be able to provide further support for you, and that's great. But at the same time, that is only if funding is available, because if it's not, then it might be a bit tricky for the teachers and the school to be able to cater for your needs. And that's going to be annoying, because if they can't, then you'll be left behind, and that's not what anyone wants to go through. And because of the lack of understanding on the topic of deafness, then it's seen as a special need, and it maybe seems a bit more patronizing for some people, or in other cases maybe it's a form of inspiration, and it's not an inspiration because you just want to do what everyone else is doing. So just because you are deaf and you go into a mainstream school doesn't mean that you should be labeled as an inspiration. So because of that, it's difficult for them to get an understanding, a compassion, maybe empathy of what you're going through. And on top of that, they're not going to understand the topic of deafness, deaf culture, deaf history, all these things. So it might be difficult for you to be able to adapt to that environment. But again, that depends on your situation. What about the advantages of going to a deaf school? Well, there are obviously many, and because you're going to a deaf school, you're not the only one who is going through the same experiences of being deaf. You're going to be surrounded by them, which means that you're less likely to be alone. You'll be communicating in the same language because it will be more oral language in the mainstream school, but in deaf school it will be mainly sign language, and that will help you to maybe improve your communication. You become more fluent in it. You will not have any communication barrier with other students, other teachers, other staff members. It's easy to get your point across, and obviously they'll be able to understand you better, not just because of the language, but because they get it. They understand what you need, what you require. They have some form of deaf awareness as well. So that makes it easy for you to be able to adapt to in that environment, which is great, of course. And then on top of all that, it's a form of pride. Deaf identity is a big thing for many people, and it's a form of pride for those who are going to deaf school. You talk about the history, culture, role models, you talk about different people in the deaf culture, and it's just something that you be proud about, and they, encourage that as well, which is something that is very unlikely going to happen in mainstream school. You very rarely, if ever, talk about that kind of topic. I've never seen that at all. But then on the other hand, the disadvantages of going to deaf school are just a few things. For example, there are questions, not necessarily definite true to form, but there are questions about the quality of the education and the standard of the qualifications that you get from going to deaf school. I'm not sure if that's even true, but that is something that a few people have said, and because of that, some of the colleges and universities, they will not be able to understand, and they will be able to maybe get confused about what you're getting, and they will not be able to really understand what you've gained from going to deaf school and whether you are able to adapt to the university. And that's something that might be confusing for them. I've talked about it being in mainstream school, meaning that you are prepared for the real world, which is the hearing world, whereas in deaf school, you're not. So in that environment, people might see it as a bubble from the real world. It's quite a complicated topic to talk about because it's not necessarily true. But if you are in deaf school, you're not really, reflecting the outside world where it's a hearing world. Most people will be using oral languages, and you want to be adapted to that. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there's not really a clear answer, but some people might see it as a disadvantage. And then perhaps one of the biggest one is that there are less availability in terms of going to deaf school. There aren't as much options as you have for mainstream school. You got less options, which means that you might not be able to attend deaf school, or you may have to uproot and go to a different location, which some people can do that, and people do that all the time anyway for mainstream schools, but not everyone can do that, and that might be a challenge for some people to not just find a deaf school and whether to move or not if they do find one is away from their home. So that's something to think about as well. But I really should emphasize again and again, and I've mentioned this earlier, that every person's experience will be different. So what I've said here will not necessarily be something that everyone will go through in terms of the pros and cons of the two schools. For example, I have my own experiences of going to mainstream school, and you can check that out as well in the link. You can check it out and how I have gone through it, what I've learned from it. But again, my experience does not mean that every single person will go through the same experience as me. There are too many factors to take into consideration, such as the level of support, whether you are mild, moderately, severely, or profoundly deaf. Maybe it depends on your family situation. Maybe you can't move anywhere. Maybe you need to know whether you are fluent in sign language or not, or are you mainly using voice. Who knows? It's just everyone is different, and that's what you need to take into account from this whole experience of explaining to you what is the difference between mainstream and deaf school. So make sure you're aware of that. But of course, some people may not agree with anything that I've said. They may not agree with some things. If not, let me know in the comments. I would love to know what you think, whether it's true or not. And also, I would love to know your own experiences. Whether you're going to mainstream school or deaf school, I would love to know your own experiences and how it was for you, so that more people are aware, there are more information out there, and so that we can help the students and parents and guardians to make the right decision. So if you have any experience and knowledge about this topic, let me know in the comment, let me know in the description, and I would love to hear from you as well. And while you're doing that, make sure you subscribe and keep up to date with everything I'm going to be talking about in terms of deaf awareness as well. In the meantime, I will speak to you again soon. Take care.